I will right away start by saying about 12 hours ago, I started to get a real head and chest cold. So I ask you to bear with me a little bit. I think I have taken the proper medication to be able to keep things at bay, but we'll see how this plays out today. So as Ben indicated, my name is Mike Zenk. So my wife Ginger and our three kids, Finn, Polly, and Rosie, have been here at KIF for about 3 years. We've actually lived in Turkey for 13 years, but 3 here in Istanbul, and have really loved it. Now, our kids are 14, 12, and almost 10. I think she wouldn't let me just say 10. She's about a week away from turning, she wouldn't let me just say 9. She's about a week away from turning 13. My math isn't, it's the cold medication, everybody, just be aware. So she doesn't want me to say she's just 9. She's almost 10. But that means that we moved here, when we had a 1-year-old and were pregnant with our second. And I really appreciate what was shared this morning about the reality of our kids growing up here and how different that is than us, those of us who grew up in our native country. Ginger and I grew up in a small country to the west of here, the United States of America. And I'll say there's a lot of things that I look at my kids and I think they are so much healthier because of the way that they think than from the situation I grew up in. And one of those things, of course, is identity. All of us have a hard time sometimes separating from our national identity, whatever. And so especially right now with America, everybody has a complicated relationship with America these days. Americans, those of us from America, have a complicated relationship with America these days. But I remember when I first came to Turkey back in 2000, summer of 2000, I was here just with a group for a relatively short amount of time. And I remember going on campus in Adana. So actually, for our first 10 years, we lived in Adana, which I love Adana. It was hard for me to leave Adana. And it's funny, I talk with my Turkish friends sometimes. They say, Adana, like it's got this reputation, like, oh my gosh, all these people, they're violent and, swearing, you'd think that people were getting in fights all the time there, but it's really, probably what, in our 10 years, we only got in 3 or 4 fist fights, I'd say. It's totally a joke. I would wilt like a flower if I got in a fist fight. So we lived in Adana for all these years. So when I first went there in 2000, before I was married, I was on campus, and I was there. Like, I can kind of blend in this country until I open my mouth, but I was with 2 very blonde people from America, and we were on campus talking with people. And I remember distinctly sitting down in this circle with, there were 3 of us and 3 students there in Adana, and we were sitting on the mall on the campus talking about spiritual things. And I remember this angry man, another student, came up and interrupted us. Now, I will say, I don't know how good his English language is, but I can tell you he was proficient in his use of English swear words. So he was very good at that. I won't use his language for some of that reason, but I'll give you a sense for it. We're having this nice conversation, and he storms up, and he says, you stinking Americans, you get your stinking Air Force bases, and you get your stinking McDonald's, and you get the stink out of our country. And he stormed off. A week later, we saw him at Burger King. So people have a complicated relationship with America, and so I get that. But I also remember, so again, how we feel about our home countries will always those buttons will get pushed. But I remember another situation just a couple weeks after that, and I had a chance with some of my friends. We had a big party with a bunch of, invited a bunch of our national friends to join us. And I remember it was really a significant time. It was wonderful. And I remember as the time was closing, there was a lot still going on, but I just started to do some cleanup. And so I started to pick everything up and nobody really joined me, and I just kept picking up, and I picked up, and I pretty much did all the cleanup, and whatever, it was okay. And the next day, we kind of debriefed the party, and everybody was talking about, Sarah, when you did this, that was awesome. Oh, Nate, when you did this, that was fantastic. Aaron, when you did this, it was fantastic. And nobody in there mentioned me in the cleanup. And I had a little bit of weird feelings, because on one hand, I don't think I did it necessarily because I wanted everyone to notice it, and yet I was realizing nobody was noticing it. And it really put its finger on something in me, and it felt kind of yucky. And I suspect you have been in a similar situation sometime, where you've done something that on one hand, you had fairly pure motives, but perhaps you realized through the course of it that maybe you were wanting something from people that you weren't quite aware of. And when you didn't get it, it started to push some buttons for you. And that's what we're going to look at today a little bit. So in my professional life, I do leadership development and human resources, so all this stuff is always in my brain, but I will say God has really specifically been working this through me for the last 5 years or so. I keep coming back to this passage, and I keep wrestling with it and thinking about it. And as I prayed about where to go today, this is just in my mind, and perhaps it's just because it's in my mind so much. So we're going to open up today to a very famous passage that we're all familiar with. We're going to open up to John 13. And before we start looking at the passage specifically, I want to just take a couple minutes. Now, I should say too, I have an education background, so when I got my degree, it's in teaching, which means I don't mind talking up front, but I'd far rather ask questions and get engagement. So that means today I'm going to throw some questions out, and we can there'll be a little bit of dialogue, okay? So before we look at John 13, I just want to get a little bit of a picture from you what's going on. So this is the passage we're going to look at, is where Jesus washes the disciples' feet. So in the context of the narrative of what is going on, I'd love to hear a little bit from you. What are some of the things, so we all are working with the same information, what are some of the things that we know either have happened or are about to happen as we're entering into this passage? And as I said, my degree is in education, so I can sit for a long time with awkward silences. So I'm not letting people off the hook, just be aware. Yeah, okay, so we're going to look at John 13, where Jesus washes his disciples' feet. But in the interest, so some of us have a lot more knowledge of the Bible, and some have less, but I'd love to share together the wealth. So I'd love all of us just shout out, what are some things that we know either happened right before this in the story or are about to happen right after that? Does that answer the question? Okay.
This is the Last Supper, isn't it?
This is right before the Last Supper. Exactly. Yeah, right.
So this is the end. So they've been with him for 3 years at this point.
They've been with him 3 years. Yep.
And they're about to have their Last Supper.
Yep. Great.
So.
Wonderful. Yeah. Thanks. Anything else to add?
The triumphal entry into Jerusalem just happened. People
Yes.
recognizing Jesus and who he was.
Yeah, so we're on a Thursday, but the previous Sunday-ish, everybody was shouting, Hosanna, Hosanna, putting down palm trees as Jesus entered Jerusalem on a donkey. So a lot of excitement about Jesus as he came in. Yeah, thanks, Mandy. Yeah.
Verse 37 in the chapter before.
Uh-huh.
Even after Jesus had performed so many signs in their presence, they still would not believe in him.
Wow. That was a constant theme. Thank you.
Last week was pretty intense with confrontations.
Yeah. Lots of confrontations. Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
The story of Mary and Martha. One of them was serving, one of them was listening, and this one serving was kind of upset with him listening.
Yeah. That's a great pickup. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. That's great. That was somewhat. Yeah. Scott.
Shortly after, Peter will deny him.
Yeah.
Will betray him.
Yeah. Yep. It's about to get very messy in their little world. Yeah. Any other last thoughts? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, Judas has already made the deal. And yet, as we're going to see, Jesus doesn't treat him any differently than anybody else. Yeah.
Jesus knows he's going to die the next day.
Jesus knows he's going to die. Yeah, that's going to be really significant as we go forward. All right, let me transition. I'm going to ask you another question. And again, this is just so we all learn together. What are some things about that culturally that would be helpul for us to know about this situation, about whether it's, climate, or it's about, who washes people's feet, or anything like that we could all be working with the same information? Yeah.
That's only done by the lowest of slaves. I mean, it's a nasty job.
Yeah, it's a nasty job.
It's kind of like being a nurse.
Yeah.
Everybody wants one, but they don't want to be one.
Yeah. It's absolutely right. Absolutely right. Yeah. Anything else culturally that would be helpful for us to know?
Wasn't like a sewage system and animals on the road, so their feet were just
Yep.
some of the kind of filthiness.
Yep. They were probably wearing some version of sandals, so their feet are open, exposed to all sorts of stuff. It was springtime. Excuse me. It was springtime, and so it's already getting hot. It's pretty dry. Again, exposed to stuff, which is why the lowest people are the ones who are going to wash people's feet, because nobody else wants to deal with that. And when you are eating communally with people, they didn't sit at high tables like we have now where our feet are tucked away. They sat at low tables. And so people's feet are right in people's business. So it was really important that if you're going to eat in a community, you had to have clean feet, or else, the food isn't going to be quite, as appetizing. We'll just say that. All right, any last thoughts? Again, before we read the passage, I want to just point out one other thing. You'll remember the disciples, Jesus asked some of the disciples, okay, go, and he gives very specific instruction. Go look for this guy with the donkey. Tell him the master needs a room. So he's in a borrowed room. Nobody is providing somebody to serve. There might have been a pitcher of water and some towels that were there. Maybe not. We don't know. But every one of the disciples walked in the door right past that and never thought about the fact that maybe I should be the one to clean people's feet. They were all just waiting for somebody else to do it. And so there we come to John 13. This is, of course, one of those passages that, at least those of us from the West, I can speak pretty conclusively for those of us from the West. This is probably the iconic picture, still even today, about servanthood in the West, servant leadership in particular. And I think we could even say worldwide, this is considered one of the most beautiful pictures. So we're going to look at John 13, verses 1 through 5. It was just before the Passover feast. Jesus knew that the time had come for him to leave this world and to go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he now showed them the full extent of his love. The evening meal was being served, and the devil had already prompted Judas Iscariot, son of Simon, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was going to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. I went back to school a few years back, and I had a professor who said something with me, and this is, again, what started this process in my brain where I keep coming back to this. But he said, emotional maturity is when you have internally appropriately answered 3 questions. Questions of identity, questions of security, and questions of power. Questions of identity. Who am I, really? Who am I? Security. Am I loved? Am I okay here? Questions of power. Do I have an ability to make anything of my world? Do I view that in an appropriate way, either too much power or too little? We have to appropriately answer those questions before we can consider ourselves emotionally mature. Because what happens if we don't? Now, I'm going to just tell you, it's not an option to not ask those questions. Everybody that has a pulse needs to answer questions of our identity, of our security, and our power. So if I don't appropriately answer that question internally, the appropriate way, how am I going to answer it? I'm going to look to you to answer it for me. I'm going to look to things. I'm going to look all sorts of other places that are not healthy. So for instance, with identity, am I the nice guy? Do I get some sense of identity from being the smartest person in the room? Do I get some sense of identity from being the person who lives overseas and goes back to their home country and people make a big deal out of that? Those are all traps, and they are waiting for us. And I'll tell you, it's easy to say, those non-Christians, whatever, Christians, we know better. Listen, we Christianize it. We just put Christian labels on answering those same questions. Security. If I am insecure, I will ask you to tell me I'm okay. Am I okay? Are we, is this good? Am I, because I suddenly become needy for you to affirm me. And you have felt that, maybe from yourself or maybe from others sometime in your life. There's just no way around it. Power. Power, we look to others to either give away too much power. I don't want to have to make that decision. Or to try to take too much power, control. We have to have a healthy understanding of those things, or else we cannot be healthy. So, that said, we've got this fantastic passage in which Jesus serves the disciples' feet. And there's one part of it that I didn't really see until a few years ago. Maybe you have. But in light of this identity, security, power stuff, where do you see that playing out in this passage?
You're asking right now?
Yes.
Well, we see that Jesus isn't, he's secure in his identity in the sense that he doesn't feel the need to go according to customs and what's expected of him.
Yep.
He's free and willing to step outside of that.
Yeah. Do you see that someplace in the text? Verse 3. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. It's almost some of the same language. Again, I'm reading from the NIV. We all have different translations or perhaps different languages we're looking at. But it's so interesting to me that we see in that moment, Jesus is well aligned. He knows, I mean, again, we're talking about Jesus, so it's a little unfair to put ourselves too much in this situation. But he has done the work to make sure he's aligned well to answer questions of identity. If Jesus, if somebody, we'll just say somebody, because it's a little easier to take Jesus out of it and just put somebody else in that situation. If Jesus doesn't answer well questions of identity before engaging in this humiliating act, what happens if the disciples start to mock him or push back on him or question what if he's even thinking straight? If he isn't well ordered and hasn't answered those questions well, he's gonna cop out. He's gonna change. It's gonna mess with him. He is engaging in the most humiliating act because he already knew who he was. They couldn't answer anything for him because he knew it. What if they had started to question him and question if, what have you been talking about this whole time and now you're doing this? What would he start to get insecure? No. He didn't. It didn't matter what they did. He was totally free from their opinion because he had done the work beforehand. Power. He had already done the work about knowing, listen, he knew with a snap of his fingers, everything could have been different. We know that. And yet, he was giving so much power in that moment to them, and he could do it because he knew that he could take it back if he needed to in a moment. We know truth. There's a diverse group of people in here, and some of us have only known the Lord for a short time, some of us for many years. We know truth. But listen, we aren't robots that if truth comes in our head, we're not robots that will then carry out that programming. We are not. We are not people who just need information. We need to do our work of working that truth through, wrestling with it. And God is very faithful to put us in situations where our identity, security, or power is called into question. And he does it so that we have to do the hard work of saying, do I just believe this, or am I going to do the work to really wrestle it and believe it down here? Because we will just Christianize it. I will Christianize it. I will know truth, but I'll just justify any sorts of unhealthy behavior and just put a Christian label on it. It's natural if we aren't consistently doing the work. Because again, just because I last week had a good sense of who I was in Jesus does not mean I do today. Because today I'm speaking in front of a bunch of people, and I had this happen yesterday, and 3 days ago my child said this to me. A lot happens. I've got to continue to wrestle with it and believe it, because if I don't, I will need that question answered someplace else. How many times have we done that, where my service is really just another way for me to get something. Maybe it's image management, because I want you to think I'm the kind of person that would wash somebody's feet. Maybe it's a transaction where I just think, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this right now for you. But in the back of my mind, I know I'm kind of storing it up so that the day comes and I can cash in on that. It's a transaction. That's all I'm doing. My motives aren't to serve. I start to become a slave. If I don't do the work to be healthy, all I'm doing is playing a game in my head. And I'll tell you, as long as I'm doing that, I am not really free to serve well. What I find so captivating about this picture is because Jesus would do whatever he needed to do to make sure he was well aligned. He would go off early in the morning, set himself aside, talk with God, wrestle with God, work truth through, not just in his mind, but in his life and in his emotions. And it frees him up to love everybody, to serve without worrying about what their response is. And as was brought up, things are about to go really badly in Jesus' community. You know, we say, well, what if they didn't like what Jesus did? Well, it's going to be very obvious in the next 12 hours or so that people didn't like what Jesus did. And they were going to mock him. And they were going to beat him. And they were going to torture him. And they were going to kill him. And never in that did he waver, because he had done the work. So let me just take the last few minutes. We're not going to go till noon today, everybody. But I'm going to ask us to take time to reflect. Listen, until the day I see Jesus face to face, I will always wrestle with where I'm getting my identity. What do I look to tell me I'm secure? A dance of power. But I'm going to ask you we're going to go through a couple questions. My first question for you, and I'm just going to give you time to think and reflect before the Lord. Which of those three is most present right now for you? Do you feel it most in a question of identity? Who am I? It seems like when people criticize me, I take it to heart. It affects me more than it should. Well, that's something about your identity there. Is that the one that God would have you wrestle through? Is it security that it's easy for anybody to make you question everything about yourself and your value and what you bring to the table? Is it power, where you feel like I don't have a good sense of how to know what I have, how to have a healthy sense for what I can bring change to and where I give to other people, or I overtake it? Which of those three, I think, would God be speaking to you right now? I'm going to give a couple minutes for you to reflect on, and then I'm going to ask you a couple other questions. My second question for you is, what's a truth that you need to chew on? Again, not just think about it. I mean, again, there's value in thinking about it, but it's easy just to keep in your head. But to chew on, there's cows will just they'll sit and they'll chew and they'll chew and they'll chew and they'll chew and they'll chew. They just sit and work that grass. What truth will you chew on so that it doesn't just stay in your head, but you really can wrestle it down into your heart so that it's more in that place of belief that once you put away your Bible and enter into the day, you're not just operating with a head knowledge, but a heart knowledge. So what is a truth that after today you just want to chew on for a while longer? So again, I'll give you a couple minutes and I'll ask a final question. I'm going to keep moving. If you have not identified one, I would just encourage you to keep working that through later with the Lord. What's a truth you want me to hold on to and wrestle with more? The last question is a little harder to get our mind around, but how can you learn to discern when you've crossed a line toward engaging in an unhealthy way? So I'm sorry, this is just a shade crass, but I'm going to share it anyway. Ginger and I had a chance to meet with a counselor just over a year ago, and I was talking about how, with my kids, I'm fine until I'm angry, and I'm like, I don't know how to know when I'm about to that point. And he said, Mike, when was the last time you peed your pants? I'm like, I don't know. It's none of your business. I don't know, when I was like 4? He's like, yeah. Because your 4-year-old brain started to realize, once it started paying attention, that there's a sensation before the act. You can do the same thing. When you start to sense, you know what? There's actually, that felt yucky. Where was the line? You know what? There. I need to think about that more. How do you catch yourself from going to those unhealthy places? Because again, I want to just say, we will all keep sliding back and forth until the day we see Jesus face to face. But the goal is to continue to be people who grow healthy. So I'm going to give a couple minutes for you to reflect, so that you know the sensation before you pee your pants, so you know before you cross the line. So I'm going to give you just a couple minutes. Does that make sense, kind of what I'm getting at there? I know it's a little harder to get around. Okay, I'll give you a couple minutes.
Or we explode and say something
Well,
we shouldn't say.
it could be, yeah.
Do something we shouldn't do.
So, again, it's a good question. And so, ultimately, I hope the Lord has just spoken to you about, something about your identity or security or power that you need to kind of focus on in the truth. But now in living that out, maybe it would be an outburst, but oftentimes these things just happen because it's a slow grade where we're not paying attention well, and we cross lines until we think, oh no, actually I totally did that for wrong motives. How do you catch yourself? That's kind of what I'm trying to say. Are there indicators that you can pay attention to? Does that make sense? Is that helpful? Okay. So I'll give you a couple minutes. There may be more here that you need to look at later. Like I say, it's been 5 years that God keeps having me work this stuff through in my own mind and heart. One of the things that I love about this fellowship, and one of the reasons why Ginger and I have landed here, is we come from all over the world, but we're here because we all desire to serve the local faith community. And that is beautiful. So my prayer is that we would be people who do that from our healthiest place, because we have done the work with the Lord well in our personal times with the Lord. So we've answered the questions so that we can engage, and regardless, because we know there's lots of rejection out there, that we could do that joyfully because we've taken the time to do the work. Let me pray for you before we go. Jesus, you are beautiful. You are beautiful. And I don't know what my reaction would have been if I had been one of those disciples as you sought to wash my feet. But I certainly can imagine I would have been confused. And I frankly am still confused in so many different ways and how you choose to serve me and to serve us. But God, we're grateful and we say thank you. Thanks for calling us to be a part of what you're doing around the world. Would we be people, Jesus, who get up and meet with you in such a way as we can be transformed and walk out into a world that doesn't want to, that often at least seems like they don't want to hear what we've got to say. Would we do that in a place of joy because we know who we are, and we know we're secure, and we know that you have all power on heaven and on earth, and we get to walk with you in that. I pray as we even go forward today, I pray you'd bless each of these, my dear brothers and sisters. Would we be salt and light in a world that desperately needs it, Jesus? In your name we pray. Amen. If you need more prayer, if there's something in particular that you'd like prayer about, please come up afterward. Otherwise, we invite you to go downstairs and fellowship together for a little bit. Oh, and Ben.
Yeah. Decided to add this at the end. So thank you, Mike, for those encouraging words. The answer to the second question I was reflecting on, and I thought, I just need to know that God is always with me. That's a truth. That no matter what happens in the future, what happens now, God's going to take care of me. He's going to be with me no matter what. And I just think that's a truth I need to internalize. And I hope that God has spoken to the rest of you about those questions and what Mike has shared. So thank you. Since we're finishing a little early this morning, an explanation about the kids program. It usually takes them about an hour to